We are in our series on Philippians, and if you want to turn to the second chapter, that's where we were last week, and we resumed after our break for the month of December. Last week we took some time and looked at the life of a fellow worker of Paul's, a fellow by the name of Timothy. Today we resume with the same kind of idea with a second worker. And Timothy's a pretty simple name. This guy's name shows up a little differently in Scripture. His name is Epaphroditus. And say that 10 times really fast. And so we want to look at his life. I want to mention just one thing about last week. The title of the sermon for last week and this week, parts 1 and 2, there's joy in serving with care. Joy in serving with care. When we have real concern, genuine concern, and real care for people, that produces a great joy in our lives to be able to do that. And the Apostle Paul spent some time in the preceding verses 18 or 19 rather through 24, I guess it is, speaking of Timothy, who was one of those good guys, one of those fellows that ministered with concern, and he continues that theme with a new guy here, Epaphroditus. Last week, a couple of points that we made relative to the idea of serving with care was simply these. Serving with care means having a genuine concern for others. Nothing imitation, nothing that's hypocritical, but a genuine concern. And also serving with care means proving oneself faithful. You don't just do it one time and think my job's finished and I can now cash in and everything and I'm okay. But it's something that comes around again and again and again. And today we want to pick up a couple of other points about the joy in serving with care based on the life and the ministry of this fellow by the name of Epaphroditus. And so we begin with verse 25 of Philippians 2. Paul writes, "But I think it is necessary to send back to you Epaphroditus, my brother, fellow worker, and fellow soldier, who is also your messenger, whom you sent to take care of my needs. For he longs for all of you and is distressed because you heard he was ill. Indeed, he was ill and almost died. But God had mercy on him, and not on him only, but also on me, sparing me sorrow, to spare me sorrow upon sorrow. Therefore, I am all the more eager to send him, so that when you see him again, you may be glad and I may have less anxiety. Welcome him in the Lord with great joy and honor men like him, because he almost died for the work of Christ, risking his life to make up for the help you could not give me." The great theologian and church historian William Barclay, when he talks about this particular situation here, the life of Epaphroditus and all that Paul was writing about here, he makes this comment. I think this just a paragraph or two sets the stage for the kind of thing that we're going to see this morning as we study. He says there is a dramatic story behind this, speaking of the verses we just read. When the Philippians heard that Paul was in prison, their warm hearts moved to action. They sent a gift to him by the hand of Epaphroditus. What they could not personally do because distance prevented them, they delegated to Epaphroditus to do for them. Not only did they intend him to be the bearer of their gift, they also intended him to stay in Rome and be Paul's personal servant and attendant. Clearly, Epaphroditus was a brave man. For anyone proposed to offer himself as personal attendant of a man awaiting trial on a capital charge was laying himself open to the very considerable risk of becoming involved in the same charge. In truth, Epaphroditus risked his life to serve Paul. Now, as we think about what's transpired in setting up this scene, this scenario, the Philippians loved Paul so much, and they wanted to minister to him, but they could not go, and so they sent Epaphroditus with a gift to do the work of ministry for this apostle, this great apostle. Now, the same thing or similar things can apply to us today, in that oftentimes we can't go ourselves to be the apostle to a particular part of the world, and so we send someone with giftedness and or a gift. we send them out to do those kinds of things. So let's look at this guy just for a few moments this morning. His name, Epaphroditus, is interesting. It means one favored by Aphrodite. So I can only assume that he must have been of Greek descent, or at least Greek religion originally, because his name bears that idea. Now, if you were to go back up into verses 19 and 23, where the Apostle Paul was writing about Timothy, he makes this statement about sending Timothy to the Philippians. He says, I hope to send Timothy to you. It is my desire, my plan, my hope to send him. But when you come to these verses about Epaphroditus, verse 25, Paul says, it's not a matter of hope. I'm not hoping anymore. This is a matter of necessity. I have to send him back to you because of all the things that's transpired in his life, perhaps for ministry purposes. But he viewed it as a necessity for health reasons, maybe. Epaphroditus' own health. He needs to go back so he can be where people can minister to him and help him get well. Or maybe he needs to come back for the peace of mind that it will bring you once he's back there, and you won't be worried about him anymore. How many of us have had the experience of sending a family member or a loved one off to a place, and when they get there, they wind up sick, and you get concerned about them, and you say, I wish they were back here so we could care for them and look after them. Paul points out that both Epaphroditus and the Philippians were concerned for each other, and that's as it should be. Paul refers to him as this brother who is this close disciple, this Christian, and he gives him a number of different tags, if you will, to describe him. He's considered a fellow worker. In other words, he's a laborer in the ministry. He wasn't just there taking up space. Sometimes if Janice and I are shopping, or if we're in a restaurant and we're just kind of dawdling, maybe sitting in the booth longer or standing in the aisle longer, and someone will need to come up and sit or get where we are, and they'll say, excuse me, and I'll say, well, we're just taking up space. That's all we're doing. We're just taking up space. We're just here for the moment. We need to get out of the way. We need to be replaced by someone else. Epaphroditus wasn't doing that. He was there ministering to Paul. Paul refers to him as a fellow soldier, one who is a protector and an advancer of the gospel. So when he came, even though he came to kind of bring this gift and to minister to Paul, that was of great benefit and great blessing to Paul himself and to the ministry of the gospel. Never let it be thought that the job that you may be called to do, or I may be called to do in the ministry of the kingdom, is a small or insignificant work. This morning when Richard was talking about communion, and he referenced the preparing of the communion. There are a number of people who do that throughout the year's time, and they know that it's not a physically exacting job. It doesn't demand a whole lot of one physically, but it does take some time, and it takes some preparation and those kind of things. And there's a whole group of folk who show up on Sunday who just see it there, as if somehow it magically appeared. Apostle Paul points out that things aren't like that for the true workers. They don't just magically happen. People have to do them. And that's exactly the way it was with this fellow by the name of Epaphroditus, sent from the Philippians to the Apostle Paul. And here's something to think about. What if Paul were right on the verge of just bailing out? What if Paul had decided before Epaphroditus got there that I've put up with this all I can. I just don't think I can do anymore. I'm just going to have to renege on this whole apostleship thing, this whole missionary. What if Paul had been thinking about that? And then all of a sudden, here a guy shows up by the name of Epaphroditus, coming to represent the church where Paul had ministered at one time, the church in Philippi, and brings this incredible gift and says, Paul, I'm here to encourage you. And everything got flipped upside down. I tell you what, I would be willing to bet this morning if I were a betting man, that at some point in time we have had some encounter with an individual in our life who turned things back upside down for us and got us back on track. I don't know if any of you know the name Lee Kynard or not. Anybody ever heard that name, Lee Kynard? I thought maybe you might have heard about him in this area. For many years, he was a news anchor on the CBS station in Greensboro, WFNY. And I remember hearing Lee, he was a well-known and well-regarded newscaster, won all these awards, but I remember hearing Lee Kinder tell the story of when he was in school. He failed the 7th and the 8th and the 9th grades. And Lee Kinder said after he had failed the 9th grade the second time, a teacher came into his life that did an incredible work of encouraging him and admonishing him to really study and work hard. And later on, Lee Kinder, of course, went off to school to study journalism and ended up with a PhD. And I mean, this special guy. But what if that teacher had not been there? What if there hadn't been that person? Epaphroditus could have been that person to Paul. We know how important he was to the Apostle Paul. Now, when you look back in the preceding verses when Paul wrote about Timothy, as I was comparing these two passages, Paul makes a statement about Timothy when he says, I have no one that's like-minded. And so Timothy appears to be a like-minded person. He's thought like the Apostle Paul. When you get to Epaphroditus, Paul doesn't say that, but as I'm reading between the lines here, I'm thinking, here Epaphroditus may not be described as like-minded, although I suspect he was. But one of the things I think we can say about him is that he was like-hearted. He loved and he cared like the Apostle Paul did. And he demonstrated that by caring for Paul's needs. The story is told that while conducting an evangelistic meeting in the Salvation Army Cathedral, or Citadel rather, in Chicago, a preacher by the name of Booth Tucker preached on the sympathy of Jesus. And after his message, a man approached him and said, if your wife had just died, like mine has, and your babies were crying for their mother, who would never come back, you wouldn't be saying what you're saying. I want to pause there before I give you the rest of the story. Now think about that just for a moment. Have you ever tried to minister to someone in need and you told them that the Lord would take care of them and meet their needs and He would provide for them and do all? You ever done that? Most of us have, I'm sure. And we give them this great spiel about how God will do all these things because of this tragedy that you might have encountered. And we say that because we believe it with all good intention, and then a similar tragedy befalls us. And we start saying, do I believe all the stuff I just said to so-and-so last week? I can still remember this as clearly as if it were happening right now. Within just a few days after my father had the debilitating stroke you've heard me speak of, back in 1986, I started asking myself this question. Ron Voss, do you believe all the stuff you've been telling everybody else all these years from the pulpit? We've done this over and over again. We've shared but do we, now that it's affecting us, let me continue with the story. As the man said, you wouldn't be saying what you're saying. Tragically, a few days later, Tucker's wife was killed in a train wreck. Her body was brought to Chicago and carried to the same Citadel for the funeral. And after the service, the bereaved preacher looked down into the silent face of his wife and turned to those who were attending. And here's what he said. He said, the other day, a man told me I wouldn't speak of the sympathy of Jesus if my wife had just died. If that man is here, I want to tell him that Christ is sufficient. My heart is broken, but it has a song put there by Jesus. And I want that man to know that Jesus Christ speaks comfort for me today. Epaphroditus was a person of care and interest. The Bible tells us that he's suffering from some kind of illness, some kind of sickness. And the Philippians are concerned about him, and he's concerned about them. But I want to say this about Epaphroditus, and you know it's true. Who knows better how to minister to those who are sick or grieving or hurting than someone who has gone through similar circumstances? So one of the points that we can think of this morning with Epaphroditus is serving with care means working where you're needed to bring blessing into people's lives. That's exactly what Epaphroditus does. Now, if you look at his life, you see this great demonstration of faith. He has this distress, if you will, for the Philippians. I don't know about you, but this has happened to me on occasion. Maybe I've been sick or something's befallen me that's been kind of bad, but I meet someone else that I know's had it worse, and I will say, "How you doing?" And I've had these people say to me, "Never mind me, how are you?" You ever done that? You ever done that for someone else, or had that someone do that for you? Never mind me. Never mind about me. What about you? The Bible says here, as Paul writes this, that Epaphroditus worked until he almost died. And yet God spared him, if for no other reason, just for Paul's sake. Paul says, look, he spared Epaphroditus, and he prevented me from having sorrow upon sorrow. It was being in prison is no piece of cake, folks, in a Roman prison like Paul was in. That's not a good scenario. But Paul says, look, it could have been so much worse. If Epaphroditus had died as a result of his sickness, how terrible would Paul have felt about everything? But even in the midst of those things, we think about moving forward in spite of our circumstances, do we not? Believing that God has something for us to do and that He's planning to bless our service and our ministry for His kingdom. That's the way we have to think. Warren Wiersbe, the great Bible scholar, tells the story of a stormy night in Birmingham, England, when the great missionary Hudson Taylor was to speak at a meeting at the Severn Street schoolroom. And his hostess assured him that nobody would attend on such a stormy night, but Taylor insisted on going. I must go, he said, if there's no one there but the doorkeeper. Less than or fewer than a dozen people showed up for this meeting, but the meeting was marked, as it is said, with an unusual spiritual power, because half of the people in attendance that night became missionaries or gave their children as missionaries, and the rest were faithful supporters of the China Inland Mission for years to come. Incredible demonstration of faith. I'm going to go ahead with it no matter what. No matter what. Look at Epaphroditus' mission. He's supplementing the Philippians' ministry to Paul, and to return and minimize the Philippians' anxiety was all that was being thought of at that moment. But notice what Paul says. He risked his very life. Now, you know that because we've done this some on Wednesday evenings, and I do it lots in sermons and certainly lots in lessons, that the words that are chosen in Scripture a lot of times, especially those words in the New Testament, have so much meaning behind them, and we don't get it all when we're just looking at it in English. But I want you to look at that phrase where Paul says, risking his life. The word risk in the original language is a gambler's word, which means to wager everything. Now, I saw online video not long ago where this guy had taken and gotten all of his possessions, all of his money, he bundled it all together and had somewhere between $100,000 and $150,000 and went to a gambling hall and bet it all on one spin of the roulette wheel. One spin. Now, I'm going to avoid that if I can, but think about that. I mean, I'm wagering it all. That's the word that's used here. That's the word that Paul uses. Epaphroditus wagered it all. He bet everything on this ministry, on this service. In the early days of the church, in the first couple of centuries, there was a group of folk known as the Parabolani, and that word means gamblers. Now, you may think, gamblers are in the church? Well, see what it means. They made it their aim to visit people in prison and people who were sick, and especially those who had dangerous and infectious diseases. Now, think about that in the early centuries of the church. There were no antibiotics to fix all this stuff, folks. And yet this group of people, knowing that they could be walking into a place where they would catch leprosy because of how contagious it was, they went anyway. They were risk takers, the Apostle Paul says. That's the idea that's behind what Epaphroditus has done. These people have thrown caution into the wind to accommodate ministry for Christ. That famous missionary I mentioned to you, Hudson Taylor, said, "Unless there is an element of risk in our exploits for God, there is no need for faith." I've shared with you before, many years ago, this preacher that spoke at a homecoming at our alma mater. He made this statement. He said, "I have a plaque on my desk that reads like this: attempt something so impossible that unless God is in it, it's doomed to fail." Because if you know you're going to succeed when you go out, that's not walking by faith, that's walking by sight, isn't it? Came across this poem recently. I thought it was kind of cleverly interesting. Listen to what it says. "There was a very cautious man who never laughed or played. He never risked, he never tried, he never sang or prayed. And when one day he passed away, his insurance was denied. For since he never really lived, they claimed he never died." James Bryant Conant says, "Behold the turtle, he makes progress only when he sticks his neck out." There's a great risk involved in ministry oftentimes. Now look down, you'll see another word there in those last verses that we read. The word help or service, depending on your translation. And this word, when it was used out in secular Greek, had a very interesting usage. It referred to men who loved their city so much that at their own expense, they performed great civic duties. They might pay to defray the cost of an embassy, or pay for putting on some of the plays, the great dramas written by the poets, or pay for the the training of athletes, like what we would do with Olympic athletes here in the United States, or paying to absorb the cost of fitting out an entire warship, or pay the crew to serve in the Navy of a state. I mean, these folks put their money where their mouth was relative to ministering to their communities. And Paul says this is the kind of help, if you will, that I could see coming, see as a part of this fella Epaphroditus. Last week we read these two verses from the first part of chapter 2, and as we referenced Timothy. You go back there if you want to. Philippians 2, verses 3 and 4. Here's what Paul wrote. "Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, but in humility consider others better than yourselves. Each of you should not look only to your own interests, but also to the interests of others." We could apply that very easily to Timothy. Today, I think we can apply them to Epaphroditus as well. You also may remember this happening last week when we ordained elders, Marty as elder and the young men as deacons last week. This question was posed to each of them. Of the elder, we asked this question: do you accept these duties and responsibilities out of no personal gain or self-promotion, but solely for the guiding of this congregation to do the will of God? This isn't something we're trying to do for ourselves. This is something we're trying to do to help other people. Of the deacons, we asked this question: do you accept these duties and responsibilities out of no personal gain or self-promotion, but solely for the purpose of serving this congregation as it follows the will of God? And so, second thing we can say about Epaphroditus this morning as we look in this idea of serving, if you're keeping score, serving with care means taking and absorbing the risk involved. It means taking and absorbing the risk involved. Sandra Goodwin wrote a poem that I want to share with you as we close up this morning. Here's what it says. "Last night I took a journey to a land far across the seas. I didn't go by boat or plane. I trusted on my knees. I saw so many people there in deepest depths of sin, and Jesus told me I should go, that there were souls to win. But I said, Jesus, I can't go and work with such as these. He answered quickly, yes, you can, by traveling on your knees. He said, you pray, I'll meet the need. You call, and I will hear. Be concerned about lost souls of those both far and near. And so I tried it, knelt in prayer, gave up some hours of ease. I felt the Lord right by my side while traveling on my knees. As I prayed on and saw souls saved and twisted bodies healed, and saw God's workers' strength renewed while laboring on the field, I said, yes, Lord, I have a job. My desire, thy will to please. I can go and heed thy call by traveling on my knees. It's true that not all of us can be all things to all people all the time. That's just true. Not all of us will be Paul. Not all of us will be Timothy. Not all of us will be Epaphroditus, but we all can make the effort to be the best us that we are for the sake of the gospel. That begins, of course, by surrendering ourselves to God completely, taking the risk of becoming a genuine follower of His. And if you're here today and that's your need, right now is the time that we give you to make that decision. But for the rest of us, these two characters we've looked at the last couple of weeks should serve as great models, great examples of who we can be for the sake of the kingdom. And maybe you've been inspired to do something specific as a result of some of the things we've read and things we've talked about. I trust that's the case because that's why we do this, partly. But if you have a need that you need to make public today, a decision that you want to let everyone else know about, we're going to offer you that opportunity as we stand and sing.